Tony and I have been married for 8 years. It was the end of 2013, Christmas time. He came home with a fever, stayed home with my daughter that Saturday, but Tony just didn't get better. We ended up going to patient first. They diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on antibiotics. So Lucy and I went to a New Year's party where we told everyone we were pregnant. But when I came home that night around 11, he just was hurting a lot in his back, having a lot of pain. But I didn't think it was emergent until around 3 o'clock. He woke me up and was asking me, "What is that bubbling sound?" I got out my stethoscope and I listened to his chest. You could just hear the fluid in his lungs. Since I'm a nurse, I knew at that point we needed to go to the ER. They immediately took us back to a room, hooked him up on oxygen, started doing chest x-rays. The doctors kept asking if he'd traveled outside of the United States, if he'd been exposed to anybody who was sick. They actually wanted to test him for HIV because they thought maybe he had advanced AIDS because he was so young and healthy, and then all of a sudden his chest x-ray was completely covered in white. So it just wasn't normal. They moved us to step down just because of how much oxygen he was on. So he stayed overnight in the hospital, but for the most part, he was stable. So I felt comfortable going home and leaving him there and going and picking up our daughter and taking her home and getting some rest. The next morning, when I got to the hospital at 10, they were in mid-transport moving Tony to ICU. While I was in the waiting room is when Dr. George, which is the ICU doctor, came out and said that he was really sick and that they needed to intubate him, which is a tube they put in your throat to help you breathe. And at that point, I got really scared. I knew what he was about to go through, and he didn't have a clue. And I got to go back and see him before they did it. He hugged me, he kissed me, he told me he loved me. I prayed that he wouldn't remember any of it. I just didn't want him to be one of those people that was like, I was awake for all that. The nursing supervisor whom I work with was there, and she offered to call down my manager. And they came down and sat with me. And while they're waiting with me in the waiting room, Dr. George comes out again and lets me know that it's not going well, that they can't get the tube in his throat, and that they're gonna have to take him to the OR to do it. She said that if there was family that wanted to see him, I needed to call them. That if he made it past 6 o'clock that night, that she would be surprised. All I could pray was just Jesus. Like, I remember sitting in the waiting room and rocking and just saying it over and over. We'd been trying for 4 years to have a baby. Why did I get the baby and not my husband? By the morning, his mom and his sister were both there. Things seemed stable, but not improving. The chest x-ray wasn't getting any better. The testing they had done wasn't showing anything. All the flu tests they were doing were still coming back negative. The doctor called, wanted to have a meeting. She really didn't think that therapy was going to help him. And at this point, the only thing that could possibly help him was a machine in Richmond that was the heart-lung bypass machine. Because we were in Virginia Beach, they used a helicopter to transfer him to Richmond, just for speed and safety. I got there around 11, and a lady that goes to the church that I went to met me at the elevator. She shared with me her copy of Jesus Calling. And that is really what I clung to while I was there. God has an amazing way of doing this where, you know, it can be written years and months and long time ago, but when you read it, it's very applicable to your day. He kind of stabilized and was able to not actually even be put on the bypass machine. With him being as sedated as he was and not moving, his kidneys were suffering. Every night around 3 o'clock, he would end up with something going on with his heart. So it just kind of became a waiting game. We got the cultures back that they had taken. It came back H1N1 positive. So at that point, we knew that that was what we were fighting against, was that virus. That's why none of the antibiotics were working, because we just had to give it time to get out of his system. I knew he was going to survive, but in my medical experience, I had geared myself up for Tony having deficits in his lungs, kidney issues. Were we going to have to be on heart meds the rest of our life? What did our normal look like after being intubated for 9 days?
The last thing I remember is that it was New Year's. The next thing I remember is waking up, and I can see out the window, and I'm like, this isn't the same city I was in. Then I look over again, and there's my mother, who lives in another state, and there's my sister, who also lives in another state, and I was like, what are you all doing here?
The doctor that discharged us said he'd never seen someone go through what Tony had been through and go home without any medication.
It was just really a manifestation of all of the work that God had done. Everything was already healing. Everything was already being taken care of.
His lungs are fine. His heart is fine. His kidneys returned completely back to normal. It's completely a miracle that he walked away from it as if it never happened. I think God was teaching me just how much he is in control and how much I am not in control. Like, this is nursing, this is what I do, this is where I know everything. You know, if I would have looked at Tony on paper, I'd have been like, nope, he's not gonna make it. But to see how the Lord's like, that's what you think, but this is what I can do.
Everything is in his hands. Whether it comes into your life negatively or positively, it comes in through his love.
We've now had Esther, who's 10 months old, and it's just been enjoying the little things and trying not to be so rushed. Just saying I love you and making the moments count.
No matter what circumstances you're in, God provides, God heals. God brought me through, so he's not done with me yet.